Okay.
All right. So welcome everyone. My name is Unli. I'm the executive director of the Dream Unfinished. This is now our fifth episode of this web series that we've started. It feels like we've been doing it much longer, and I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but but here we are. And for those who are not familiar, the Dream Unfinished is an activist orchestra. We use classical music as a vehicle to engage audiences and dialogues around social and racial justice. And we have certainly been doing that in the concert hall for a number of years, but partially from obvious COVID restrictions and partially because we really want to be where the people are. We have been embarking on this web series and trying to use this platform as another space where we can be having these dialogues around current issues and how they play out in classical music. So I'm joined by our master production manager, Sarah Overton, and we're just to give you a quick preview of what to expect for today. So we will be splitting up today's episode in these two segments. The first is Instruments for Change. So we'll be discussing a current issue as well as pointing people to different sorts of resources or initiatives that are related to that issue. And then the second segment will be what we're calling Yet Unheard. So these are lesser known, but not lesser deserving masterworks by underrepresented composers. I think we can go ahead and just kind of dive in. And the issue that we want to raise to kind of pick up from a couple episodes back where we were talking around health disparity outcomes. So I believe it was in our episode 3, we were focusing on the real sort of unfortunate differences in maternal and infant mortality for Black families.
Okay.
All right. So welcome everyone. My name is Unli. I'm the executive director of the Dream Unfinished. This is now our fifth episode of this web series that we've started. It feels like we've been doing it much longer, and I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but but here we are. And for those who are not familiar, the Dream Unfinished is an activist orchestra. We use classical music as a vehicle to engage audiences and dialogues around social and racial justice. And we have certainly been doing that in the concert hall for a number of years, but partially from obvious COVID restrictions and partially because we really want to be works by underrepresented composers. I think we can go ahead and just kind of dive in. And the issue that we want to raise to kind of pick up from a couple episodes back where we were talking around health disparity outcomes. So I believe it was in our episode 3, we were focusing on the real sort of unfortunate differences in maternal and infant mortality for Black families. And today we'll be talking around Native American health disparities specific to coronavirus. So I'm going to just do a quick screen share. And to first point to a WebMD article that's quite recent from last month. And so as we all know, coronavirus has had a really devastating impact on communities all over, but particularly communities of color. And as this WebMD article points out, particularly then in Native American communities. So just to give a sense of the sort of scope of these statistics. So 1 in every 475 Native Americans has died from COVID. And as there's been much made in reporting, Black Americans have been disproportionately impacted, but that's even worse than the Black American population. For Black Americans, it's 1 in every 645. For Pacific Islanders, it's 665. Latinos, 835. White Americans, 825. Asian Americans, 1,320. And I'm also props to WebMD for disaggregating Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans. I sort of wonder why we're all lumped together. But particularly in an instance like this, where actually, Asian Americans are double of what it is for Pacific Islanders. But in any event, what we're talking about in today's episode is Native Americans. And I mean, this is just a devastating statistic. Like, if you're thinking about like, because I think part of the scary thing with numbers is that statistics often make things so abstract, particularly when the numbers get really big. But you can imagine 475 people in front of you, and then imagining one out of every 475, and then imagining the multiples thereof. Like this is something that you can picture in your mind's eye, which I think is, so much speaks to the sheer volume at how this is taking place. Sarah, I don't know if you have any reactions that you want to jump in with.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, in our first episode on health disparities for Black families, we talked a little bit about the social determinants of health. Just access to quality education, to quality healthcare. And we know that for Native American communities, these social determinants are so often, I think they're difficult to, it's difficult for Native American communities to have access, to those same, the care that they deserve. So I know that that plays such a big role in this, and it's so evident in this really unfortunate death rate.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think that points to how really, COVID, if anything, in some odd way, has been a symptom rather than a cause of things, right? Like, as you were saying, because of, what we could kind of more sort of in a macro sense, think of the pre-existing conditions in which there has been this kind of devastation. So this is from the National Congress of American Indians, and these are some stats around their demographics. And so, and I remember actually reading this and also just being kind of surprised at the numbers that, it does go into the fact that there are like 5 million people who identify as either American Indians or Alaska Natives. And those are only of the voting age population. So even just getting a sense of the breadth and scope of Native American presence, I found very educational. But then with that, yes, so these health disparities. So even before things like COVID entered our lives, Native Americans, American Indians, Alaska Natives, they had a lower life expectancy by 5.5 years. They have higher rates of heart disease, of diabetes, of chronic liver disease and cirrhosis. Also self-harm and suicide, which I think points to like mental health issues and probably, a lack of resources in that sense. And so there's this is actually quite comprehensive in terms of giving like a overall picture, but I found that some of these statistics were also very telling, that 4 in 5 American Indian or Alaska Native women will experience violence in their lifetime. That the rate of assault or homicide is more than double the rate for the country as a whole. So again, that unfortunately, as this article is pointing out, not only has COVID been so terrible, and in recent months, apparently it's been even getting worse, but I remember once actually saying, hearing a quote from a journalist, or maybe it was a health official, something like, COVID is a virus that it like preys upon these existing inequities, and it like for populations who are already vulnerable, it in that sense, like the virus has eyes. I think that's the way that they were talking about it. And so with that, just wanting folks to be aware of the exact sort of scope of this, and how pervasive it is, and then also letting folks be aware that, as we try to always point out with our Instruments for Change section, that there are other organizations that they can be looking into that are really trying to address these kinds of issues. One of the ones that we could find is the Great Plains Tribal Chairman's Health Board. little bit of a mouthful, but it looks like they're actually doing quite a bit of work around public health and safety, particularly for Native American communities. They actually have a very active Facebook page, as I was able to visit. They're doing a ton of virtual and Zoom outreach, and seem to be very connected with their communities. And then also there's the National Council of Urban Indian Health, because I think, unfortunately, people have a very sort of broad kind of stereotype or understanding of Native Americans on Indian County or in Indian reservations and things like that. When of course, as these numbers from the National Council indicate, like they're all over the country, including in cities. And so there is this organization that's dedicated specifically towards those Native American populations that find themselves in more urban or metropolitan communities. So, again, this is really tremendous work that needs to be undertaken, but we have organizations like these that are at the forefront for really advocating for these kinds of topics and issues. And then also there is, of course, recent news with Deb Haaland. For folks who are not aware, Deb Haaland is the first Indigenous Interior Secretary, and she, and she had already been a real sort of trailblazer in being one of the first of, I believe, two Indigenous Congress people and to be recently appointed. And I think it's very interesting too, not only in terms of the fact that she's a pioneer by her identity, but also because she's been such a strong advocate for environmental issues. And so with that, and particularly with the duties around being the Secretary of the Interior, not only for those who are keeping an eye on environmental issues, but then part of her sort of jurisdiction or oversight is around what is experienced by different Native American populations all across the country. But I think her appointment really points to the fact that, again, that this population is here, they're present, and by having her in such a powerful and prominent position, that that can just underscore the fact that this is really a segment of the United States that needs to be much more amplified in terms of like how we are making policy decisions, and what it is that we're doing for communities of color on a broader scale.
Yeah, and what's so wonderful about this? I think she talked about in this article, or there was a quote that I saw about H.H. Stewart, who was long time ago, I think it was 1800s, was a former Secretary of the Interior, who made it his mission to either exterminate or upend tribal people and tribal lands, Native American lands, and now with Deb Haaland sitting in the same seat, her vow is really to reverse all of that damage done, and make a lot of progress. And I think it's just so important in terms of reclaiming stories and reclaiming history that for so long has been just totally morphed, to a larger narrative, and to have, real people of Native American ancestry, Native American heritage, tell their own stories and shape their own futures, and be in positions of power like this is really wonderful.
Yeah. Well, and so to shift gears to a musical note, as you're just talking about, Sarah, as people, because actually, when I've been trying to do some research around programming for Native American topics, there's actually an abundance of music but it's not by Native American composers. But we should note that Native American composers have a history and there is a body of work. And there's one composer in particular that TDU is very excited about, who's a living composer. And Sarah, I think you're going to share a little bit more around Wantio Vicente.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk a little bit about Wantio Vicente because his music is so it's so interesting. It sort of it has a lot of these like Shostakovich influences, a lot of native influences, and he's just really exciting in terms of the things that he's putting forward. So I want to screen share a little bit so that we can kind of take a look at who he is as a person before we go on to looking at his music. So let's see. And can you see this? Great. Yeah, so he is a composer who has just really been composing all of his life. The music was just within him. So he was primarily interested in piano when he began, but then later moved on to composing and just really forming his way. Here is a picture of him and just in his southern Utah, where he kind of grew up and did a lot of his growing up. So it's really exciting in terms of just how he presents himself as a musician who is also just kind of living and working and trying to project some of his Native American heritage within his music. So this is a great example of one of his pieces. It is a string quartet called The Forest at Dawn. And I want to share a little bit about this music, but before we do, I think we've got some terms to define for folks. His music isn't necessarily major or minor, and when we say major, we're thinking of like happy music, predominantly really happy music for our non-musician friends.
I wonder, Sarah, if it's worth I'm a terrible pianist, but maybe if I just hop over and play a C major chord so people have a sense. Yeah. So major being something like, oh, this is so out of tune too. So
a little bit more uplifting, a little lighter, a little happier, and then if you would be so kind to play a minor scale, a C minor scale. Right, a little darker. Then when we talk about there being in major or minor, it's definitely light or it's definitely dark, right? So Wantio Vicente's compositions they can sometimes get a little bit atonal, meaning that it's not definitely light or it's not definitely dark. It's somewhere in between. It kind of mixes all of these sounds together. So you'll hear a little bit of that in this piece, The Forest at Dawn, the string quartet composition. And he particularly says about this composition that this piece is about the light, specifically the descent into darkness before the light. I spent a week in a mountain residency in a cabin with no electricity in 2009. It was strange, sometimes frightening, but also a much needed experience. Eventually, he says that it's an optimistic piece with sights set on the future. So let's hear a little bit of The Forest at Dawn. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen one last time here for folks. Great. Let me try this one more time. I want to make sure we can, got it. So I'm gonna pause it there. It's such an exciting, just a really exciting, like forward, a lot of forward motion there, a lot of just really wonderful sounds coming from those instruments, sounds that you wouldn't usually expect from a violin, viola, cello, or bass, or violin, viola, or cello. And do you have any initial thoughts just kind of on that piece and hearing it?
Well, and I loved actually where you ended, or when you ended, I should say, Sarah, because it goes from the what I think people would call like minor or almost like an edgy sort of tonality and harmony to right where you just stopped was when, like, if we're leaning into the composer's metaphors, like the darkness shifted into a light and like we were getting the happier chords. And yeah, I mean, it's also just the, this section, I mean, people should definitely listen to the longer work. It's as you could probably see on YouTube, it's like a 26-minute piece. And it goes through just so many different moods and sort of like landscapes that can take place. But that particular section, it's so muscular, like it's very athletic writing. I mean, I can only imagine, like, I'm sure you as a cellist are thinking like I would be so tired playing all of these like moving notes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I picked up the score and I tried to play a little bit of it just before we got on today, and I was like, "Oh, I'm exhausted." My forearms are tired. It's a lot of like back and forth and over. But what's unique about it, even though you have a lot of that repetition, that undergoing engine, you're engaged the entire time. There are so many
Mm-hmm.
small changes in each line.
Mm,
For any of the instruments, that it's really neat just to kind of, you have to be with the music. You have to be really,
yeah,
really in every
yeah,
moment. But I mean, just so exciting in that, and just kind of the thinking of how we keep the musicians present, that I don't see really in a lot of composers. So I'm excited for that, especially.
yeah. Yeah, I feel like a lot of the web episodes or so far has been like all the music that TDU wants to program eventually, especially like when we get back into having in-person performances. And this is definitely a piece that's on the top like priorities of stuff that I would want to make sure people are aware of. And if others are interested in programming this, so as we'll share in the articles and links as we always do, the article that Sarah had shared on from the Navajo Times. So from our understanding, Juantillo Vicente is a bit of a secluded composer, I think is the right word for it. We do have his contact information. So if people are interested in procuring the sheet music, please reach out to us, send us like a message or leave a comment on YouTube. And then we can follow up and because the composer does provide PDFs for the sheet music. And if you're interested in supporting the development of Native American composers more broadly, so Juantillo had also participated in the Grand Canyon Music Fests. They have this apprenticeship program for Native American composers. So we'll drop that in the link as well. But I think we're going to close it here. So just really wanting to thank you, Sarah, for joining me, and thanks to folks who are tuning in. And we will be back with more episodes. I think with a slightly different lineup next week too, in terms of hosts. But again, the same topics of classical music, different sorts of social issues, and how those two may intersect. And we look forward to having you tune in and join us then.
All right. Thank you again, everyone.